Welcome to our panel this afternoon. Our discussion is going to be on Solarwinds. What the heck happened? I'm Sandra Liepkalns, and I'll be your moderator for this session. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature, and we'll be answering them at the end of our session. Please welcome our panelists today, Sonal, Casey, and Mark. Could each of you please give a quick intro? Sonal?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Sonal Shetkar. I'm a principal sales engineer with ExtraHop. I actually covered the New York metro region, so I work with a lot of customers across a bunch of verticals, covering all the way from financials to healthcare to even retail, as well as colleges and universities and things of that nature. Very, very excited to be a part of CyberX as well as this esteemed panel. Hope you all get something out of this session.
Thank you, Sonal. Casey?
Hi guys, my name is Kalyan Chakravarthy. I know it's difficult to pronounce, so I go by Casey, like the Casey and the Sunshine Band. And I'm the Chief Information Officer for the region of Durham, and the security reports to me as well. So I'm really happy to be on this panel and learn from my other people in the panel to know about what is this, like, and how can we make sure that, like, we are not in that position.
Thank you, Casey. And over to you, Mark.
Hi, my name is Mark Dillon. I'm the VP of IT for Waterloo North Hydro, which is an electric utility in Ontario, Canada, in the city of Waterloo. And I also have the burden and privilege of having security report to me, which means at some point something might be my fault. So let's figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Mark. So from a SolarWinds perspective, software providers are always sending out updates to their systems and bug fixes and features. So SolarWinds was no exception to this. Earlier last year, they sent out software updates to their customers unknowingly that they included compromised code in it. And this code created a backdoor to their customer environments that could be used by hackers to install additional malware to spy on them. Flash forward to today and our panel discussion. So what the heck happened? And how can we prevent this from happening again going forward? So our first question, Mark, we know that this attack was spread through regular patch management processes. What controls do we need to have in place when updating our systems?
So the first thing I want to say about this particular attack is, obviously, it's really cool. Like, when you look at the actual story, like, it's not good that it happened, but this is like movie villain level stuff, right? Because it's very methodically done with a massive amount of patience across a number of years to get where they got. So this is not your typical, password spray or botnet, but it still is the same end result. And that's that something was compromised, and then that compromise was disseminated to a network of trust. People who decided that it's okay to download and bring those patches into my network because that's a trusted product. So that's the first place we start at, is that it's a trusted product. And as these things are being disseminated, maybe we shouldn't assume, just like we're learning that identity is the new perimeter and that being in my building doesn't make it so it's okay, maybe we should also examine what a tool can do and what privileged access it has, so it can do what amount of damage when we assume it's compromised rather than assuming it's safe.
Casey?
I think Mark covered the most important thing, like as it is like this, can we have prevented, would we have known? Like it took a lot of time to really to get to the where we are. So one thing from looking at from another perspective is to really say, how is our preparedness to respond to this is what we can be prepared to really look at it and say, when this happens, are we ready to know what is the repercussions of it in our own environment? Because like we talk about, a lot of people talk about, okay, this is what has happened, it has affected 400, like this many companies. But like if we are one of that organization, what is the ripple effect that we are having and how we can remediate it is what like we need to be ready with. So planning and like assuming that like this is going to happen again, it might be Solarwinds today, tomorrow it can be anything. But like when it happens today, the first thing is like, I think we need to remove the stigma of these security attacks or ransomware attacks, because like this is like having people with COVID, right? Like people, as soon as like you hear that like these people are being affected with COVID, there is a stigma attached to it. Like the same way, like we need to remove the stigma attached to it and say that like this is going to happen for most of the organizations at a small level, at a big level, but at whatever the level that is there. So once that happens, how can we share that information with others? And are we ready to really look at what we need to do to remediate is what we can plan. It's not about we could have prevented. I don't know what else we can talk about, segregating the networks. We can saying that like, okay, we should not do automated patch management. I have read a lot of people going to the another extreme of it, but like practically that is not possible to live in that kind of a world where we have to really test every patch that is given by our nth level provider, because it is not even from the SolarWinds. SolarWinds might have got it from their the whole supply chain is there. So we can't test the nth level provider. So we need to be ready with what if it happens, how can we remediate it, and what is the effect that we have currently on that?
Right. I think it's also how do you contain it? Identification and containment, are critical in these situations. So, if you look at from a digital product perspective and software development, how can we now prevent having, errant code being injected into our code repositories and into the CI/CD pipeline? Sonal, what do you think about that?
Sure. I mean, honestly, for this question, I would love to hear what the other panelists have to say as well, largely because I think I kind of concur with what Casey was talking about earlier, in the sense that if we're specifically talking about Sunburst, then the code that we were talking about, that malware Trojanized code that was injected into the build systems, it was digitally signed by SolarWinds, right? So like, how much are you expecting you as a consumer to actually be able to control that in your CI/CD pipelines, because this is already digitally signed. You're trusting your vendor when you download the software. And even from SolarWinds' perspective, maybe yes, they could have taken some additional measures where they could have scrubbed their credentials, across the repositories. Definitely, there was some additional stuff that they could have done there, but to be completely honest, these kind of supply chain attacks are not new. They've been happening for a very long time. This is a consequence of this open source world that we live in and these repositories that we download software from. So I kind of concur with what both Mark mentioned and Casey mentioned earlier, in the fact that it's important that we realize that we live in a post-compromise world and be prepared to have a strategy of what are we prepared to handle the situation, assuming that malicious software is getting downloaded. But we'd love to hear what the other folks have to say.
So Mark, what do you think in this area?
So for those that don't know, we're talking about continuous integration and continuous deployment. This is the idea that you're doing lots of small commits. So for example, one of the things that Walmart bragged about was they had something like, 500 commits a day, where if you work in an enterprise space, you maybe upgrade your thing only once every 4 months and use this massive upgrade. The world's shifting towards, 5-10 patches a day potentially, right? And then you go ahead and you do your loading and whatever, maybe you put it in a test environment. So inside of this pipeline, it's hard to scrutinize what we call commits, a change to code that's going to go into production, because there's just so many of them from all of these different places. So that's very challenging. And some of the places I've worked at, we've talked about this. Well, how do we audit our code, right? let's say you have the privilege of getting the source code. Even then, still, how do you audit it? So we see things going back to as far as Heartbleed, where someone made a commit that was maybe a mistake, maybe not, but it let people have a flaw in OpenSSH, which was a really big deal. We see things like Lenovo deploying laptops some years ago, the Superfish bug, which is a supply chain problem attack, I don't know, where the private signing key for a certificate that was trusted by the laptop when you got it was included with the laptop. So now you can just grab this private key and do whatever you want with it. So to Sonal's point, these supply chain things aren't new. This one is spectacular just because of the scale of what happened. You know, we had like 7 to 10 governments attacked and like 15 private companies. Many of them were actually security companies that were exploited through this because of the tools that they used. So what can we do? I think bug bounties are great. I think behavioral pattern analyzing is good. You know, where did you log in from? How fast did you type? Is it possible you could have written that commit in this amount of time? Is this your normal pattern for this user? Is this the kind of thing they normally do? If it's anomalous enough, then maybe that's weird. Maybe that gets flagged. The code might still get committed, but moving towards sort of the anomaly detection in code style, you know, maybe you can even do something similar to like a linguistic analysis on the code that someone writes. That's not how that person usually codes. These are very complex concepts that I'm not even sure if there's products for yet, but something like that, maybe it would work. But to Casey's point, to Sonal's point, you're going to get attacked, right? And it's going to be successful. So the first thing is just assume that and then prepare accordingly.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. So what about this attack made it particularly difficult to detect? You know, the attackers were really sophisticated in this one, and it spread really quickly. Was noticed really quickly. And the intensity and the impact was particularly devastating across a lot of organizations. What made this so unique? Sonal, can you take this one?
Sure. I mean, concurring again to what some of the things that we've already discussed. Like, I think what was interesting about this attack, especially the second stage of the attack, where command and control was established, there was lateral movement happening, there was data exfiltration happening, or maybe some alternate persistence that was established. All of that, if you look at it, and even through the amazing amount of blogs and reports that are already out there regarding the attack campaign, you'll realize that, well, all of this sounds pretty normal in the sense that from an attacker standpoint, it is a very standard playbook. So from that perspective, it looks pretty standard. But I think what was more interesting was that initial compromise itself. Not just that build server, putting that malware, that Trojanized malware into the build servers, but what was interesting is how much the attackers went at length to hide their tracks, all the way from ensuring that that code was hidden within unsuspecting code, then making sure that as soon as those DNS beacons started happening, they were happening at randomized intervals. In fact, the beaconing wasn't even happening right away after you downloaded the malicious code. It happened maybe 8 days, maybe 2 weeks, or maybe even a few months later. So that whole slow way in which that attack took place was what made it difficult to detect. And not only that, I think by the time even the FireEye report came out, which was probably in December, and that's when people actually started looking at the IOCs and started looking at, hey, okay, has any of my servers or any of my systems touched this avsmclouddomain.com, which is now infamously blacklisted. I think a lot of time had already passed. In fact, like a lot of this compromise had happened all the way back in March and even April. And many, especially as I was working with a lot of my customers and prospects, they didn't have data going retrospectively back then to even validate whether, hey, did I have my servers touching this domain? If they were, did data actually get exfiltrated? Was actual malicious activity, taking place in my environment? So a lot of that validation was missing, largely because their strategies did not involve collecting that information at that scale and for that such a long period of time. So I think that's what made it more challenging, even for customers or even for people after they knew what they needed to look for. They just didn't have enough data to be able to validate that. And many of my customers were largely relying on standard SIM solutions, EDR solutions and things like that. But even the logic in the code that the attackers built in was just so smart, where as soon as they realized that, hey, there was Microsoft Defender or Carbon Black installed on the server, there was logic built in to evade it, or disable it. And that's what made it more difficult. Your traditional perimeter defenses, things that you have deployed as antivirus and EDRs, just didn't work to catch it in time. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents there, but would love to hear what the other folks have to say.
Yeah, no, great. You've got a great point of view there where, the attackers are getting so much more sophisticated today that, if you're starting to build that type of logic into your malware products, that you're not executing straight away, you're actually staggering to make it look like standard traffic. That's really scary, because yes, it evades most of the things that we do have in from a perimeter perspective, from an internal perspective, as well as if you think about the data, we need to collect the right data. We need to make sure that we also store it for the correct length of time. So KC, do you have anything else that you would like to add into that as well, in your point of view for this?
I think the other thing where, like we talked about, like where I try to go away from the acronyms and like tech speak, and I want to take, I think this attack is like COVID. So that is the virus where, like, I think we need to take a lot of similarities and what we have done to really overcome this, where like segregating of networks, like where like the biggest different thing that happened about is, like, as Sonal has mentioned, it was about like, it was hard to detect. And what we do after we detect is the most important thing. Like, I think where most of the products, most of the tech companies, most are like focusing on how to prevent it. But I think we need to understand, and like as Mark has said in the previous one, that like this is going to happen, maybe in a different form. It might not happen in the same form now, like how it happened, but it might happen in a completely different form. So what do we do after that? Like, is the biggest thing, and like we need to be ready with it. And how it will happen, we don't know. But like what we do after it, we need to be ready with.
Okay, great, Casey, thank you. So Sonal, when you're talking about, AI-driven models, trying to be able to understand what's going on in your network infrastructure, the communication aspects, the type of data that we need to collect to be proactive in this. So can you expand on that in what do we need to do, or what are we going to be seeing, or what should we see?
No, absolutely. Like, in fact, like even going back to what I just mentioned, like a lot of my most of my prospects and customers that I talk to, they have a very traditional focus on maintaining their defenses. As I mentioned, they largely depend on their logs, or they depend on the EDRs and antivirus solutions to take care of most of their defenses, which is of course great and absolutely needed, but it wasn't sufficient for an advanced threat like Sunburst. And largely because, as you just mentioned, when you think about Sunburst specifically, even those initial DNS beacons that happened, how many people actually log DNS? Like, there are very few customers who actually log DNS, because it just results in so much of a volume in your network that you don't have the ability to even search for some of these domains, even if you knew that these domains were malicious. So that was one of the things that my customers struggled with. And not only that, even if you go to those later stages of the attack, where you're looking at lateral movement, where you're looking at data exfiltration, things of that nature, you're looking at protocols like Kerberos, like SMB over CIFS, Active Directory, things like that, which don't traditionally log that well. So if you're only relying on your log-based solutions, then it's just not going to give you enough. And for a covert attack like Sunburst, you need a strategy that is itself covert. And what is better than being able to tap into your network itself? So if you actually have a strategy where you're able to look at your network traffic and be able to catch data sets and behaviors associated with each of these protocols, then you're better equipped to be ready for situations where, even whatever be the reason that you got compromised, you at least have the enough intel to know that, hey, this system doesn't typically behave this way and has now started behaving anomalously. So when we talk about AI-driven models, yes, I mean, I think the existing AI-driven models could have still worked for Sunburst. I mean, there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to catch those command and control beacons, etc. But what a lot of people missed was not having enough of good features or data sets that were powering these AI engines. Because especially if you're dealing with a solution like Solarwinds, which already demands privileged access in your network, then even these detections that you're getting from traditional tools are going to be noisy. they're going to be calling out and saying, hey, SolarWinds does this, A, B, C, and D. And you tend to ignore these, saying that, hey, SolarWinds is expected to do this, so let me just ignore that. And what we instead need is an approach where the traffic or the data set is rich enough to tell you that, hey, this particular detection, even if it's SolarWinds, shouldn't be doing this, and why. And this is abnormal for this infrastructure to do. And I guess reaching that point is difficult, but it starts with making sure that those models are fed with good data sets. And what better than something that's actually the network itself, because no matter what, your attacker cannot evade the network, even if he tries to, disable logs or disable EDRs or even your antivirus solutions.
Well, yes, everything has to traverse the network infrastructure. So, it's critical for everybody. And I always say this, you have to understand what the behaviors are in your network environment. You have to really take a look at that, because a lot of times people ignore the network infrastructure itself. And that's where everything traverses. Mark, how do you feel about the models and what data we need to collect?
So the many things that Sonal said, I completely agree with. So the reason why we would look to use something like artificial intelligence or machine learning, whatever it's being called, which is typically a computer program that does things. And what computer programs are good at is automating human behavior. And artificial intelligence, so we have people, process, and technology. And artificial intelligence doesn't always fit in the technology part, because it's not a program you wrote. It's a program you trained, learned. It might be edging closer towards the people person. At some point, we might have some kind of HR process for these things. But I'm emphasizing that because it's extraordinary, but you also don't know exactly how it's coming to its conclusions, which someone was talking about. It can be noisy. It can be, well, we'll disregard that because it's SolarWinds. Don't worry about that. So the AI is freaking out about it, but don't worry. So the reason why we're going to start to need some of these tools is because the technology deployments we have are so complex that you can't fit it in your head. There's no way that one person can do that. So you need to create an abstraction layer of some kind. And for that to be useful, 100%, you need to collect all of your network traffic. The problem with that is that the modern version of cloud creates a huge visibility gap. So if someone's at their house and they're logging into their Office 365 account, you just don't see that anymore. Maybe you got your HR platform or your ERP platform, on a software as a service model, and people are going directly there. Or you've got, machine to machine communication over APIs that's going directly there. And you don't capture it. So this is a huge visibility gap we've created. So before we can even start to take advantage of that anomaly detection, which is exactly correct, think of it like most people have done an intrusion prevention system. The first thing you do is you put it in detection mode only and run it for like 6 months and say, okay, now it knows what normal looks like. So now I can turn on the blocking mechanism and not, break the business. You need to do something like that with network traffic too. But before you can even start, you need to look at your full baseline. You can't just look at the part that conveniently you have because it goes through your building's pipe.
Thanks, Mark. KC, do you think that the SolarWinds attack is going to reshape how we use threat intelligence feeds and how they're being shared?
I hope so. I think whether it will happen or not, it's a different thing. But I hope that it really changes how we share that information all across, whether it's between a vendor versus an organization, or in between, everywhere. It should be on the open platform to really share about, because once it happens somewhere, it might be happening somewhere else. So that kind of data sharing becomes a most important thing, because we talk about the network piece of the things. But now, as Mark has just mentioned, it's not just our network. There are a lot of things that we use that we are dependent on, whether it's an Office 365 or an HR platform or any other thing, which might have happened that might compromise on our data. So basically, it is your data is no longer in your premise. Your data is no longer in a cloud. Your data is no longer with one single person. It is so distributed that now this threat intelligence, the TI, this whole part of it should be a collaborative effort and not a concentrated effort.
I concur with you. Exactly. So do you feel that because of this, or as a result of this, governments, private sector, and public will start doing more collaboration besides increasing our spend in security, to deal with situations like this, are there other changes that you feel that are going to come as a result of this in those collaborations? Casey, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that is going to come because like it goes back to the first point that I said, right? Like it is about that stigma. I think that needs to be removed plus like where I'm seeing that like which organization or which entity really takes that step towards going it. And once that is removed, more of the public sector is ready to share that information because tended like most of the time like the public sector like they keep it like yes there is open data, there is open government, but like due to a lot of restrictions that that they have, they are not able to provide that information to like in a broader way. I think once that like stigma is removed and like once we know what kind of data that needs to be stored like shared, I think that is one thing where I expect some of the one of the security vendors, whoever that is there, leads this whole effort to say what data is useful to really for from a broader perspective. I think defining that, because we can talk about yes we need to share data, yes we need to share broadly, but what do we need to share needs to be defined. And I think once that definition somebody leads at some organization, I think most of the organization will join that rally. And I don't know where to pinpoint which that organization would be, and I hope that like that comes in soon and somebody takes that lead.
Sonal, how do you think the collaboration will be going forward?
No, I think I completely agree that there will be a lot more collaboration than what's been happening so far. And I guess the Sunburst situation has been, and I hope, a wake-up call to enable that. Largely because, I mean, if you think about it, these nation state sponsored attacks have been happening for a while. And from their perspective, doing these kind of attacks makes sense to build their offensive capabilities, to do espionage, which is exactly what happened in this scenario. But largely what happens is that even if it's largely done for geopolitical reasons, at the end of the day, just like what happened with Sunburst, the private sector gets affected in the crossfires, whether you want it or not. And the only way you can actually ensure that data sharing and knowledge and proper defensive strategies are being built, because we're definitely just going to see more and more of such attacks happening, is through knowledge-based sharing. And it's only through both the private and the public sector working together, sharing this knowledge. That way, as these offensive things are happening, you actually have good strategies to make sure that you can defend yourself, make sure that you're prepared and have the right remediation. So I definitely see this increasing more, and largely because cyber attacks are just something that is low effort, but extremely high payoff. And that's why nation state sponsored attacks are definitely going to happen more and more. And that's why collaboration is needed even more. Absolutely.
Excellent. No, I agree with you completely. So Mark, you look at the companies who know that they have actually been part of this compromise or part of this attack, but then there are also other companies who are either a third party of a company who has been part of the attack that could also be impacted by that breach. How likely is it that companies who didn't even use SolarWinds, how have they been impacted? Or do they even know? Or is anybody actually really talking about that? We're starting to hear about, the third parties, but, it's not really top of mind for everybody if you weren't the SolarWinds customer.
Yeah, so that's that, your third, fourth, and fifth party points of entry, trusted partners that you share networks with, things like IPsec tunnels and so forth. They are a fourth party and you're their fifth party. And the thing I usually, so it's scary, right? Because we all agree that let's just assume there's someone on my network right now, right? That this laptop that I'm using, that someone could have remote access to it anywhere from the manufacturer supply chain to, the dozens of tools that I've downloaded. You just have to start assuming that, which is kind of scary. And I think that the only way that and we're all extremely understaffed in this because the opponent is automated and their business is to attack us. Our business is our business, whatever it is. We just want to do it safely. And there's this huge disproportionate thing, both in the amount of due diligence required to protect and audit, and also the fact that our opponents are very motivated. Like Sonal said, it's low effort, and for the most part can be largely automated. So I'm thinking about the sharing of information that we can talk about. And most of the projects I've seen so far, I'll call vanity sharing, right? So that we can say that we're sharing. But to truly be sharing so that all of the private security tools that I use all tap into a central place where they talk to each other, only then will we have a hope of noticing that, oh, looks like you've got that thing from 4 years ago, now that we know what it looks like, even though you were not part of it at all. So other than, clear and burn and rebuild your entire network through infrastructure as code or something like that, or a full zero trust, which I haven't talked to anyone who can actually achieve that yet because it's so cumbersome on the user experience. I honestly don't know what to say to the people who are, I guess I'm one of them, right? We didn't have the product. We don't know partners that have it, but somewhere we could have been affected by this, whether it's, someone has a spouse that works at a company that had it and they brought it home somehow and then it got transferred over to there and then they brought it in here, or there's all tons of ways that this could have happened to us. So I genuinely say, I guess, assume that you are compromised and then tell yourself you're going to act accordingly, and then probably you won't.
We should.
Yes, we definitely should.
We definitely should. And Sonal, how do you feel about, the impact on third and fourth and fifth party organizations?
No, I feel like Mark has done a really good job of covering that question. So there's nothing much I can add there, but just being a field engineer myself, where I work with a lot of customers across different verticals, I just have a little story to add there. And this is not a personal story. This is a story from one of my peers while working with one of his customers. And basically, just like Mark said, like this customer didn't have SolarWinds. So when we were bringing it to their attention in December, many of us getting out of our PTO and helping our customers and working with them, then we were like, okay, I understand that you don't have SolarWinds, but are you sure that there's no infrastructure in your environment that could be running the software? And something that we can do as a part of ExtraHop is this idea of software fingerprinting. It's just a consequence of what we do as we profile the network. So this peer of mine, he literally just, while he was talking to the customer, just ran a quick ad hoc query looking for, hey, software equal to SolarWinds Orion. And literally as soon as he did that, there were 4 assets that popped in. And the customer had no idea that these assets existed in his network. And the more he looked into it, he realized that these assets were owned by a different team, and they were actually doing a POC of SolarWinds. So they weren't a customer, but they had these assets running in their network, running the SolarWinds software. And since they were running a POC, they made sure they were on the latest software because they wanted to get the latest and greatest features. And of course, they had the Trojanized version there. So in this situation, it wasn't as bad, largely because their POC was in a lab environment. So even the assets that potentially got compromised weren't their crown jewels. But just to add to what Mark said, like sometimes you don't even know that such softwares exist. And no matter how many controls you put in place, silos exist in organizations. And it's always possible that somebody might be running it in their own contained environment, but as a consequence of such breaches, things could get worse. And that's why I completely agree that dependencies and codependency attacks and all are happening, quite a few now. SolarWinds was just the beginning. But yeah, it's definitely something that deserves everybody's attention, and yeah, hope that helps.
Yeah, and trying to control everything control and know everything that's on your network infrastructure is becoming more difficult and more difficult all of the time because of the sheer size of organizations, the complexity. But it's something we really need to pay attention to. We pay attention to people being able to put laptops on our network infrastructure, but we sometimes don't think of the other customers that we have within our organizations who are utilizing the network as well, who can actually use it and place things on it. So how do you think, Casey, how do you think this is going to change how things are reported and how we respond to incidents as well in the future? Are we going to have more transparency? More coordinated responses to this? How do you think this is going to go in the future?
I think that basically what this has done is it has shown vulnerabilities even for the best of the organizations can be part of this. So what this gives is that transparency, like where people are more ready to come out and say, hey, this is what has happened to us. So it is going to start at least paving the way for more transparency. And what will happen in that is like where the biggest challenge that we get in is about knowing what happened. Because as like when Sonal was talking about, like there are a lot of shadow ITs that will be there in most of the organizations. I think there are two big things where like any IT organizations, I feel that like where you won't even know that like this happened are from the shadow IT, because you're not like where it is not with the corporate part. The second is the IoT devices that are like popping up. Like you can control your devices that are there from an infrastructure level, from your switches, your routers, your traditional ones. But like these IoTs, like I think those will be the next level where that will come in, where we don't even know, we won't even notice until something happens. So yes, to answer your question, Sandra, like where yes, the transparency will come in, more people will be able to discuss about it. But I think what will happen is identifying it will be delayed now, because the complexity of how, when, what happened is becoming more and more problematic. Because even till date, as Marcus said, we don't know the extent of where it is. We don't know, and like I don't know we'll ever get to know the extent of it. I don't even see how anybody would identify to say this is the extent, these are the people who are affected. So think about it like something happening from an IoT perspective where we won't even realize something that has happened. So the transparency will increase, but the detection point of when it will happen and the effect of it might reduce. That's how I think about it.
And I think also the fact that you don't want to report things or raise the flag too early until you actually figure things out. Now even we're getting more information is coming out about this particular attack, and as it unfolds, we'll probably still be hearing about things a year from now, if not longer. And so it does take time, but you also don't want to jump be the first out of the gate if it's not really true either. So you could have the reputational damage there as well. Mark, how do you see the future of incident response, and as well as reporting of these types of things?
I think we're almost already at information overload as a society about this stuff. When CVs weren't good enough, we started giving them catchy names. Now the catchy names are normal, and it's like, oh, that thing happened last week. Okay, well, no, I'm on to this new thing, the week that we're currently in, which has been like 2 or 3 pretty important ones, right, in the last week. And it's to the point now where, unless you're a technologist, you're just glazing over and saying, yeah, that computer stuff happens over in that computer land, but that doesn't affect me, right? But it really, really does. So a simple example is, and you might think it's benign, but in every home in Ontario, there's a smart meter, and that's IoT. And they're manufactured somewhere. And for all we know, where it gets manufactured could have been hit by this through a third party. And now it's on the firmware. And we get a new batch of meters. And now it's on every house. And what's it doing? And are we checking it? Can we even check, right? So in IoT, you run into some things where it's proprietary sometimes, or it's just so different that, your normal tools of analysis aren't built for it. And so I know I'm not answering your question, right? I'm kind of thinking about this out loud. And so your question is this going to change anything? And it'll probably change the cultures and the way that the places operate that were hit directly. I'm pessimistically saying it's not going to change anything else.
I think in a lot of cases, as IT professionals, we're actually getting desensitized to all of this. I don't think business people are getting desensitized yet. We do hear about breaches, whether that's personal information or data. There's still, organizations are still very concerned, but I think from an IT perspective, this is kind of the norm now, which is really scary.
Yeah, I think we're just moving slowly in the direction of catching up, but it's like probably a decade of work before it's normal to be able to notice and respond to this stuff, and we can
Yeah.
only hope that we're not outpaced by the adversaries.
Well, that's what always happens is you plug the holes, you wait a bit, and then they pop up someplace else. So unfortunately, it's the whack-a-mole, and hopefully we can get out of the cycle of whack-a-mole. So anyway, thank you, everybody. We do have some questions. So first question is, what does the attack tell you about the necessity of establishing dev environments before using any product post-upgrade within production cycles? Can you,
I can go on it.
Casey, go ahead.
Yeah, I can go on it. Like, I think I don't think if anybody is waiting to hear about this attack to really have the demo environment before having any product or post upgrade. I think they are in a bigger soup than what they like than this. And one thing this has come to it is that security hygiene is very important. What you can do, what is there in your control is not about what other parties are doing, but what is there in your control is that security hygiene. I think that security hygiene must be maintained, irrespective of like any attack that is happening or not.
I think we actually covered off one of the questions. Could you help our audience understand how much the damage of this breach still remains unknown? And I think we've, touched on that we're still learning. We're not going to know the extent of this for a really long time, particularly when it comes to, the third party, fourth party, fifth party, and so on. So it's going to be a long time coming. Remote access into the enterprise environment. Has this increased the malicious impact of the sunburst experience? Sonal?
Sure, I definitely think that it has increased the malicious impact of most threat vectors out there. It's just that now that if any asset within your data center is getting compromised, there is always a chance for that attacker to now laterally move into your individual workstations and from your individual workstations into your home networks and things of that nature. So absolutely the impact of any threat vector out there has increased with the remote world that we are living in at the moment.
Okay. Our next question is, we are all looking at AI as being helpful to the protection of our systems, or helpful to our protection layers. Sorry. How is AI used on the flip side to attack our network environments? Mark?
So one of the ways I know it's used is for discovery and enumeration. One of the things you need to do as an attacker is take a look at your landscape, who's out there, and what are they up to? What versions of stuff are they running? And what's the business all about? So I can kind of rank my targets. This is the easiest and most expensive person I want to go after. So, one of the people listed in the breaches, unfortunately, again, was Equifax, right? Which we also don't know exactly what happened there. But I'm sure that the targets that were picked that we know about, going after FireEye and stealing some of their red team tools, that's very thoughtful. So it's possible that the shortlist was created by AI in this example, or some form of sophisticated algorithm that can do things, faster than a person. And it may also be used, but I don't know because I haven't thought to read about it, but it may also be used to help avoid detection and stay alive longer inside the organization. But that's speculation.
Okay. Casey and Sonal, do you have any additional points of view there?
I think I completely agree with what Mark just mentioned. I feel like AI and ML is used a lot as the same term, but slightly different. So I completely agree with what Mark just mentioned, where there's definitely an AI element involved in identifying who is a juicy target from the target's perspective, especially when you're trying to enumerate a bunch of victims out there. And even with Sunburst, I think there's a lot of information out there where the DNS responses were in such a manner where they sent specific responses to activate or put it in a passive mode, depending upon how juicy the target was. So there was absolutely an AI element involved there just to do it at the scale that it was doing it. And we are definitely seeing a lot more of this with any new attack that's coming out there. Absolutely agree.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that was our last question. If anybody wants to put in a question quickly into the chat. There's no other questions coming through. So thank you, Sonal, Mark, and Casey for participating in our panel today. Your points of view have been really informative. It's been a great conversation. I guess the bottom line is we're still going to be working through this whole scenario for yet a while to come. And I guess my key takeaways are we have to understand what is in our infrastructure. We have to ensure that we're collecting the right amount of data. We're making sure we're keeping the right amount of data so we can actually do the appropriate analysis and analytics on it and the correlations of all of those things. Securing our CI/CD pipelines as well is really, really important, our code repositories. And, trying to be, 2 steps ahead of the attackers and maybe stop doing the whack-a-mole. So anyway, thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Talk to you later.
Good luck,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Go look at your networks.
Thank you.